Okay, thank you very much indeed. That sounds right. Unfortunately, I don't know what Milda said. So I hope that I give the speech she introduced. I wanted to talk today, as the slide says, about the role of museums and libraries in creative education. This isn't about how museums and libraries might fit into the current Creative Partnerships programme. It's about what we've learned about creative education that museums and libraries could use to think about how they work with young people generally. And that's the focus. It's an area of work we've become more and more involved in, working with museums as far apart as Newcastle, Norway and Western Australia, because the principles around creative education that we've come up with seem to ask quite a lot of quite deep questions about how museums and how libraries interact with young people. But I think they also create really exciting opportunities for museums and libraries in thinking differently. This is a photograph of one of my children, and I always like to start my presentations by sharing some family photographs. But there's an important message here. This is my son Ben, and he was about 6 when this photograph was taken. And he'd been taken by his school to the local theatre because the school believed in taking the children to expose them to theatre, to museums and so forth. And on the day that Ben was visiting the theatre had hired a photographer to come and take photographs of the children having a wonderful time at the theatre, because they wanted to use the photograph in their annual report to show what good education programmes they had. And they liked this photograph most of all, but they had to contact me to ask permission as his parent to use the photo. And I said, yes, no, that's a lovely photo, can I have a copy? They gave me the copy. And I took it home and I showed it to Ben. And I said, I have this lovely photograph of you, Ben. And showed it to him. I said, do you remember that being taken? He said, yes, I'd gone to the theatre and we were watching a show and there was a photographer taking photographs. And I said, well, the theatre wants to use the photograph because it's such a beautiful photograph of a young person transported with joy by their experience of the arts. And he said, yes, looking at it. I said, can you remember what you were thinking when he took that photograph? And Ben said, yes, I was thinking, thank God that's over. Now, the significance of the story is it's very easy to persuade ourselves that one-off opportunities to engage in the arts actually have a long-term impact on young people. But there is no evidence to support this. If you want young people to develop an appreciation, an understanding, an enjoyment of arts and culture, it needs to be part of their everyday life, all the way through their youth and their childhood. And therefore, what we've always been interested in is how to develop programs which allow that to happen. So we put creativity, culture and the arts into every aspect of school, which is what the Creative Partnerships does, or after school, or whatever. So it becomes a language they are comfortable with, that they are confident in, and they can use whenever they want. So, how does it work? I'm going to start by talking a bit about the theory. I should say it's very nice to see so many old friends here, but they'll find some of this boring, I think, because they've heard me talk about it before. A useful way of thinking about what we do is to think of the UNESCO definitions of education, and they're called the 4 pillars of education. learning to know, learning to do, learning to be, and learning to live together. And one of the problems is traditional education systems focus very much on the learning to know, acquiring knowledge, the learning to do, developing some technical skills. But the really important parts of education are learning to be, discovering who you are and how you operate, and learning to live together, being able to build the ethical and moral framework that governs your behaviour. And our work is always focused very much on how you can add the learning to be and the learning to live together into everyday school life. And this is also an important model to think about. What you have here is a quadrant with the bottom going low system to high system and across going low functioning to high functioning. And what this is really trying to show is that the schools in the top left-hand corner are schools which are very high system. There's lots of testing, there's a very strict curriculum, everybody knows what they're doing and so forth. And they can get high test scores, but they often result in very low pupil motivation and independence. And cultural and artistic activities, which you find in many schools, are often disengaged from the real learning of the children. It's something you can do which is fun, but it's not connected with the really important part of learning. And we think what's important is to use the enjoyment, the pleasure, the insights, the engagement that cultural and artistic activities bring to put into the main education systems in the school. And you then end up with schools which still have high test scores, but they have independent and intrinsically motivated pupils. And how do we go around doing this? We get schools to identify a problem that they want us to work on. And we then send specially trained creative professionals, our creative agents, of which there are a number here today, into the school. And they develop a project which addresses the problem the school is concerned about. And the problem could be speaking and listening skills in grade 1, it could be maths in grade 6, it could be boys' behaviour in the playground, it could be geography in grade 10, it doesn't matter. It's an area the school are worried about. But what we do is create a space, a project. And what's important about the project is that it has a set of special characteristics. Now, we've done a lot of research into the Creative Partnerships programme in England. And we did lots of separate pieces of research, and we studied the impact of the programme on test scores, on pupil attendance, on pupil behaviour and motivation, lots of different things. And we showed that children who went through the programme did indeed get better test scores, were better behaved, were better motivated. But we then went on to ask our researchers to tell us why they think that happens. What happens in the classroom that produces this positive impact? And we had a number of different studies, one by the Institute of Education in Cambridge, the other by the Education Faculty at Nottingham University, another by Winchester University. And they all came to the same conclusion, that the impact we had was because the classroom was managed in a particular way. And the summary of how the classroom was managed was this slide here. On the left-hand side, you have really a much more traditional education system. And on the right-hand side, you have the kind of classroom management that we try and encourage. So if you take the role of the teacher, in a traditional education, the role of the teacher is very often to impart knowledge. So the lesson plan is designed to lead the pupils to some knowledge that they will require, and at the end of 45 minutes they'll be tested on it. Our researchers said there are problems with this very transmissive, knowledge-focused form of education. The problems are that the less able students aren't able to find their way to the answer on their own without the structure that the teacher puts around it. But worse than that, the more able pupils work out that the teacher is going to give them the answer in the end. And they call this minute 38 syndrome. So the bright pupils think, I don't have to pay attention for the first 37 minutes, because at minute 38, the teacher is going to tell me the piece of knowledge that I'm supposed to learn in this lesson, and I'll then be able to write it down and test it on it. And there's a really wonderful article written by a professor of education at Nottingham University, where she followed round a bright 14-year-old girl in her school for 3 days to work out how many minutes of real learning she did in 3 days. And she worked out it was 14 minutes, because the rest of the time she didn't need to pay attention. So we try and encourage an approach to designing lessons in which the pupils are busy all the way through the lesson, by designing the activities in such a way that everyone can be getting on with it, and it's not dependent on the teacher. The nature of the activities, the exercises you do, are supposed in our system to feel very real to you. Organisation of time is much more flexible. The organisation of space will tend to have a pupil focused on the task as opposed to the teacher. There's a lot more group working. The visibility of the processes was a very interesting point back from the researchers. In creative partnerships programs, children and pupils are often making things which will be very visible to everyone afterwards. So they might be studying biology, but what they're doing in the biology lesson is writing a play about the biology issues, which they're then going to perform to the whole school. They might be doing maths, but actually they're doing the maths in the school gardens because they're using it to build a big structure. So the outcomes are very visible. But with highly visible outcomes becomes high risk. When pupils are normally working in class, they will be writing in their notebook. The teacher might look in their notebook, but often the teacher never looks in their notebook. They do a piece of work and they hand it in to the teacher. No one else actually gets to see it. So it's very hidden. But in our systems, the outcomes are very visible. And because they're very visible, they're high risk. If everyone in the school is going to see your work, then that's much more high risk. And what the researchers argued is that in traditional education, we take too much of the risk out of learning, and it becomes boring. And risk actually is very motivating. And if you can put risk back into the learning, and this doesn't mean physical risk, because emotional and intellectual risk can be as risky, as dangerous to you. It gets much higher levels of motivation. The location of the activities are very mobile. The children are wandering around the class, they wander around the school, they use the school grounds, they go into town. They are a learning resource. Quite often schools say to children, leave yourself at the gate. Everything you need for learning I have here in the classroom. But actually our approach is to say, no, you bring something of real value. Your perceptions, what you see, what you hear, really matter in the learning. And that's very positive for children. And they feel much more engaged because they feel that their presence is valued. Emotion is acknowledged as being part of what goes on in the school. A lot of schools try and pretend that school is an emotion-free zone. But I was working with some grade 6s in a primary school in England recently. And I said to them, is it important that teachers do creative things in school? And the pupils said, yes, it's very important. And I said, why is it important that teachers do creative things? And this boy, he was about 11, he said, I'll tell you why. When my teacher's teaching the normal stuff, she's got her grumpy face on. And if I don't understand, I don't like to ask. But if she's teaching her creative stuff, then she's got her excited face on, and then I don't mind asking. Well, in this meeting there was the school director and some other teachers as well, and you could almost hear the adults breathe in, because the pupil was exposing one of the big lies about education. Because what the boy was saying is, I change my learning behaviour according to the mood I see my teacher is in. And teachers like to pretend they're always in the same mood, and that's not true. They're always in different moods. And the fact that we don't acknowledge emotion, I think, is a big problem in school. I think it's a particular problem in developing boys because they don't deal with emotion so easily as girls do. But I think if you're educated in an environment where your emotional literacy, I see she's in a bad mood, but nobody ever talks about it, it in the end undermines your own belief in what you see. And you think, well, maybe I don't see it, and so forth, and it makes it more difficult. You design classes inclusively so everybody can have a go, and the result is learners who are much more self-managing, which is really what they need to do.